I've started my podcast because I think it's so hard in most media to tell it like it is. Yes, I think Trump is rancid meat. I mean, it's a metaphor. But I think he's someone who's injected a kind of toxicity into American politics that doesn't belong there, that hasn't been there before, that doesn't represent what Republicans have stood for in the past.
So that, or other journalists not calling it like it is, covering Trump like the unique candidate that he is?
I think it's more the contortions to try to make things seem equal all the time. So if you look at Hillary Clinton's speech, where she basically pointed out that what Donald Trump has done actually quite well is normalize white supremacy, one of a long list of things that I think many Americans would find distasteful.
And you would say that's true. The Clinton is right when she says that.
I think she made a very good argument, almost like a lawyer. Here is ways in which he has actually worked to normalize conversations that many people find hateful. And that listen, I've seen on air white supremacists being interviewed because they are Trump delegates, and they do a 5-minute segment, the first minute or so, talking about what they believe is white supremacists, right? So you have normalized that. Then Donald Trump will say, well, Hillary Clinton, she's a bigot. And it's covered. Journalist part comes in. It's they trade barbs. He says she's a bigot, and she points out that he might be appealing to racists.
He said, she said, he said, she said.
It only becomes he said, she said. When in actuality, the fact that Donald Trump has said she's a bigot, without the long laundry list of evidence, which if you looked at Hillary Clinton's speech, she actually did have a lot of really good factual evidence that we would all agree are things that have happened and do exist. They're treated as if they're equal. Well, she might be a bigot. He might have ties to racists. They're actually equal, when in reality they're not equal. And I think that's where journalists are failing in the contortions to try to make it seem fair.
But so that may be the default, but I've seen a lot of good examples of the press, I think, doing its job of calling him out and telling it like it is. You know, whether it's you on this show saying there's no basis for him to claim the election's going to be stolen, or the New York Times saying in the front page lead story, Trump presents a threat to the rule of law and the Constitution. Not on the editorial page, but as a news story, because that's fact, not opinion.
So that's a more optimistic take. Mark, let me get your assessment on this. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic about how the press has been trying to treat Trump?
Well, first of all, since we are stepping back, I should step back and say that, in fairness, a lot of Hillary Clinton supporters would say that Jacob was just being unfair to rancid meat in comparison.
Oh, boy.
So I believe that, no, I just think that we have to have both sides here. I would say this. Look, I mean, I think there are a few terms here that we're using that I think are kind of flawed. I mean, the whole grading on a curve thing, I mean, no one agrees on the curve anymore. I mean, that's the central problem. I mean, the notion of a curve in, say, math, like in 4th grade math, if this test is graded on a curve, there is an objective number that you are grading on. There is absolutely nothing objective about the agreed upon, you know, whatever. I mean, the more agreed upon argument in our culture that there is one arbiter, whether it's Walter Cronkite or Tim Russert, that can decide. So, I mean, I think the notion here of sort of false equivalency, whatever you want to call it, is not so much to strain to compare both candidates to one another, but to compare them basically to the truth, to actually use your platform as a journalist to say, look, I mean, what Donald Trump just said has no basis in fact, or Hillary Clinton has said this, in fact, she has not given a press conference in 200 and however many days. I mean, I do think that it is incumbent upon reporters to, when a blatant, you know, falsehood is spoken, to actually either parenthetically or just state it explicitly that this is just not true. But I also think that when you get into the on one hand, on the other hand thing, and then make a judgment where you say, this is racist, this is white supremacy, you're basically trying to overturn a judgment that's been rendered by one of our two major parties, which is that this person is acceptable to be their nominee of a party. And obviously it's not a unanimous thing, but I don't know if it's journalists' job to make that rendering.
So that is it difficult, as someone who's been on air for a number of years, CNN and NBC and elsewhere, to say flatly, this is not true, or in the case of something Trump supports, this is white supremacy? Doesn't that put you at risk as a journalist?
The gentleman I'm referring to refers to himself as a white supremacist, right? This is not me saying, wow, he sounds like a white supremacist.
Okay.
He would tell you.
He doesn't even say white nationalist.
I
mean, that's the approved euphemism.
So
Donald Trump, racist. A lot of journalists do not say that. A lot of Clinton supporters would like journalists to say that.
Yeah, and I actually think often people jump very quickly to racist. To me, I'm very slow to call anybody a racist, and I think in this case, it's irrelevant. The thing that we're talking about is, are you softening the ground for people who are white supremacists, who are white nationalists, who would self-identify that way, to feel comfortable with their views being brought into the national discourse to the point where they can do a 5-minute segment happily on national television? And the answer is yes, clearly, and there's lots of evidence of that. Do I have a question, or do I have a hard time saying to somebody, that's just not true? No, I probably am overeager to do that. I actually think it's one of the most interesting and compelling things about being a journalist and being able to interview people, is when you find politicians who seem notoriously challenged with the truth often, to be able to say that's literally not true, and here's how it's not true. I think that's great. It's a great moment, and we should do more of it.
Maybe the question is it happening enough? Mark, let me go to you on this. I saw a lot of viewer emails in advance of this show. One of them said she's so frustrated that the media insists on treating Trump and his surrogates with, quote, kid gloves. Do you think that's been happening in the television coverage?
No, I don't. I mean, I think obviously, television coverage is, it's not singular. There are a lot of different interviewers, a lot of different reports, obviously.
Right.
I do have a pet peeve, and I think it's been especially glaring in this cycle, about just the ability of a lot of TV interviews to be steamrolled by, especially Trump's filibusters, his long answers, things that are often not true. Same with a lot of the Hillary surrogates. Hillary hasn't done that many interviews, so there's a harder comparison there. I guess we should say that Donald Trump gets immense credit for making himself as available as he has. At the same time, though, I think there's been way too much patience for listening to Kellyanne Conway or Brian Fallon or Donna Brazile or whoever. I don't want to pick on them, but I guess I just did. Just filibustering one show after another, which has been going on for years, obviously. But I think that also is a form of false equivalency, because TV's public affairs shows can say, look, we have this side has been represented. It doesn't matter if what they've said is either complete nonsense or just bad television. It's just what we do, and we've covered those bases. I do think, though, that there's been a movement in, especially, in certain, on certain, with certain issues, to actually become more aggressive, which I think is absolutely appropriate in this case.
So one more minute here before we go to a break. Jacob, I think some critics would say we're too tough on Trump surrogates and not tough enough on Clinton surrogates. Do you see a false equivalency there?
I think, well, part of the problem is the sort of equal time for surrogates. I think there'll be a real calling to account after this election about the role of cable news in particular. Well, I think early on, I think there's a real case to be made that Trump was overcovered. Now he's a presidential nominee. He could be president. You can't, you sort of cover him as much as you want. But when he was low in the polls, he's been so good for the TV news business financially. And I don't think reporters consciously exaggerated his importance because of that. But I think it has an impact. And I think if you look in the early days, he got too much attention based on where he was, and particularly from cable news.
So, Odette, do you agree?
Well, I think if there's any lesson to be learned, it's, wow, so over the top, hateful speech brings a really interested, angry audience. This is genius. We should do this more often. What shall we do when this election is over? We're going to have to think about ways to really rile people up, make them angry, and divide them, because that is something that I think cable news, frankly, and everybody can cover really well. So I find it very frustrating. I believe he was overcovered at the beginning, but now it is he said, she said all the time. We have lost context. We actually often don't even cover the details of something. We just cover the back and forth of it. It's funny to watch if it weren't our own country and our own government actually operating.
You're talking about hateful speech. That makes me wonder if it's just as compelling on TV to watch people fight back against hateful speech. If you believe what Trump is saying is hateful, is it just as compelling to watch people argue against it?
I don't know. I don't know that you see people argue against it all the time. I think when you see, I think it's very compelling to see video of people beating up Absolutely, yeah. I think that has been. I think the quality and the level of discourse has dropped so far. It saddens me to see, and I don't think we're going to have this reckoning that happens after the election. I think it has made a lot of money.